He's muted.
Nigel. He's on mute. There we go.
Right. Sorry about that. For those who are watching, and indeed I'm now going to tell my fellow panellists, we've just had a message from Chris Loder to say they are stuck in the Houses of Parliament on this vote, and they're going to be delayed by about 30 minutes, which is boring, bearing in mind that that means that there'll be a 2-hour delay from when they said they could do it. But there is nothing that we can do about it. So what I propose to do is start the discussion off and actually get our panellists, and this is a curveball to them, but I'm actually going to get our panellists to ask the questions that they were going to ask or will be asking the Secretary of State. I'm going to ask them to pose their questions and see if we can start a discussion amongst the panellists about the answers to those questions and their thoughts. And obviously I would welcome anybody who is watching to send in their questions to me, and I can put them to our panellists before we hopefully get George Eustice and Chris Loder to join us. Nothing obviously that we can do about it. We just got to sit and wait. I'd rather do that, I think, than merely just ask you all to sign in at an unknown time, because inevitably we'll have people signing in at different times. So apologies that it hasn't worked quite as we'd anticipated, but dealing with parliamentarians and votes in the House of Commons is always a bit tricky. We only knew about this literally about 6 o'clock tonight to start with. So I hope you don't mind us doing it like that. I suggest you all pour another large gin and tonic or a glass of wine. We might have to go and get one. But anyway, chaps, I hope you don't mind doing that. And this is obviously going to be all off the cuff, that we don't mind doing it in the way that I'm suggesting. They say they're going to be, they're saying actually we may resolve this. They now say they're only going to be between 5 and 10 minutes, in which case, if that's the case, I think we could wait. Having said that, to keep you all entertained rather than listening to chit chat about cricket.
I'm nervous about what's coming next. Really.
Yeah. Andrew, why don't you open, because you've got more questions. Oh no, actually, Alistair, you had more questions than our standard 3. Do you want to pose one of your questions to your fellow panelists? What about the TB? Sorry, well, Jim actually is the TB question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Jim, why don't you pose the TB question?
I just wanted to talk about how, we are in an endemic area, and the bugbear of TB has shrouded my whole life on our farm. We need to be able to help ourselves to do a job successive governments have been unable to do. The technology's there for our vets to help us a damn sight better than the old test can. But the government is loath to let us use that test. But we would severely like to put pressure on our Secretary of State to ask him why we are not allowed to use the technology that is out there to try to rid ourselves of this problem. When we have a breakdown, we need more help than we're getting in getting through these breakdowns.
There's a related issue that has already been sent to me, a related question, which I'll also add into the pot whilst Andrew and Alistair are thinking about what they want to say. But the question that's been posed to me on the TB issue is that this is putting a huge strain. Testing every 6 months is putting a huge strain on every cattle farmer. And as a dairy farmer, from this questioner, who rears beef from the dairy, testing young stock when grazing is no easy matter. There must be a better way, or else I fear the large numbers leaving dairy farming will only increase, and our ability to supply enough milk to the country will be severely impacted. So that's the question that's already been sent in on a related issue. So, Andrew, dairy farmer.
Well, do you want Alistair to start on that one, being the vet?
Okay, I don't mind is the answer. I don't mind.
I think.
I wholeheartedly agree with what Jim has to say. I have to admit to a vested interest in been a co-developer of one of the new OIE validated Melplash test. But
can you explain what OID means?
OIE, so it's basically the World Organization for Animal Health. So it's the equivalent of the World Health Organization for Animal Health, and it's the intergovernmental group that oversees what tests are. They oversee sort of testing programs, surveillance programs, agree basically the rules that allow into trade between countries on what tests are appropriate. So if your test is approved by the OIE, then in a sense, it's good enough for trade. And it's a very, very rigorous degree of assessment that goes into achieving that approval. It is, it's hugely regulated and a very difficult thing to achieve. So if you achieve your OIE validation, what you have is a very robust test. And the frustration we have is that we can't, the rules and conditions that are set by government as to when a farmer can, or a vet who wishes to advise a farmer this may be helpful, can use our test, or for that matter, an IDEX test, which is another OIE validated test, are hugely restrictive. First of all, in the scenarios where you can use it, so you can only use it in herds that have under a TB breakdown, that already had a whole herd gamma interferon employed and are still under breakdown. And even then, the requirements are that any positive animal must be removed before the animal can retrieve OTF status. Well, if you develop more sensitive tests, which is what we have done, or the IDEX would do, or whatever, you're going to find more animals than we are currently, and then requiring all those to be immediately removed for the farm to regain OTF status puts a huge, economic strain, almost unviable strain on the farm itself, which, would be a Pyrrhic victory. You get rid of TB, but you get rid of the farm. So what we're looking for is, in the same way as we manage a disease called Eustice disease by using the level of antibodies produced in the test to decide which animals need to be removed and which can be retained because they're lower risk, to do the same with TB by farmers and vets, decide which animals are high risk and need to be removed, manage the ones that are positive but look to be low risk, and therefore manage the disease hopefully more slowly out, but in a sustainable manner. Now, say the government, the regulations, etc., just don't allow this private testing to take place. It doesn't cost the taxpayer anything. The farmer's paying, is taking the risk on the culls that they take. So there's no downside, and we're going to understand more animals that, if the farm does regain OTF status, if they were allowed to move, could have spread TB that wouldn't be allowed to spread because they would be restricted to the holding. So there is just no downside to the UK taxpayer and government, and lots of plus sides for farmers. And for some reason, we're not allowed to do it.
Can you talk us through how that test works?
Yeah, it's slightly, I'll have a go. It's much more, unlike the standard TB test, which are the skin test and what we call the gamma interferon, which are looking for sort of what we call cellular mediated immunity. The Melplash test, or the IDEX test, are looking in a much more conventional way for antibodies to bovine TB. And the way you do that is you choose antigens, which are the sites the antibodies adhere to, that are specific to the bacteria M. bovis. And our test chooses 11 M. bovis antigens that are highly specific to M. bovis, so we don't get cross-reactivity to other, similar forms of mycobacteria, and put them on a little well. And if you pass blood or milk, which contains those antibodies, over that well, and you've got antibodies specific to that antigen, those antibodies stick to the antigen in the same way as your COVID test works at the moment. We then get a light reaction by a bit of chemical wizardry, and we can measure the amount of light, and there's sufficient light of a spot where the antigen and antibody are combined. That's a positive spot. And if we've got more than 2 positive spots, you've got a positive animal. But the more diseased an animal is, the more antibody you have, so the more individual spots light up. So you can have to a maximum of 11 spots, and the more light they emit because there's more antibody bound. So you get a real sense of how positive and how diseased an animal is with TB. And that allows you the potential, but it has to be proven yet, to manage out high-risk TB animals and retain low-risk TB animals.
Alistair, how accurate are the tests? I mean, do you get false positives with them, or are they nailed on?
So this is what the OIE is, partly about. So we've tested over 2,500 samples from the UK, from herds with no TB, and the false positive rate is less than 0.2%. So the specificity is 99.8, and the sensitivity is far higher than anything we've produced so far. So the problem is, in a sense, it's too sensitive, but that is life.
Well, we have a visitor. We have a visitor.
Hello.
Hello, Secretary of State.
Hello, Nigel. And Chris is attempting to join in my office by a different computer at the moment. But
that's fine.
Yeah, first of all, apologies. I'm sometimes late, and it's my fault. But this is just, I'm afraid, relentless votes as Labour try to derail some of what we're trying to do on the immigration bill. So we've afraid, as Chris might have explained, I'm afraid we've still got another, probably, we think maybe 2, possibly 3 votes. So we might have to
zip out.
Don't worry,
break
don't
off,
worry.
and you have to talk amongst yourselves. So apologies for the disruption.
No, that's fine. We started by ourselves. We thought we
Okay, very good.
might as well start playing the ball. The only question is we couldn't decide who was going to take your role and be the Secretary of State. So anyway, none of us volunteered for that role. So is Chris likely, before I start properly, is Chris likely to be there?
Chris is here. Chris can hear at the moment. I think he's okay. So let's.
Should we start?
Yeah.
Can we
Okay.
finish that question we were just doing while we're on that topic?
I'll come, Jim. I'll come back to it. I'll come back to it as the answer. I won't spoil the excitement of talking about TV, because no doubt George will want to throw some comments in. So what I was going to say is, obviously, welcome to everybody who's watching. Particularly welcome the Melplash Show panelists who have agreed to kindly take part in this, which is Andrew Frampton, James Badditch, and Alistair Hayton. And I'll introduce them, or actually they will introduce themselves in a minute. I'd also like to welcome Chris, who is about to join us.
I'm here,
I think
Nigel.
he's there. Thank you, Chris, for joining us and help organising this. And obviously our greatest thanks is to our special guest, is obviously the Right Honourable George Eustice, Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. George, it's very, very kind of you to actually take up your time to join us. What I'd like to do very quickly is just to say a little bit about the Melplash Show and who we are, what sort of organisation we are. No doubt you've been to Stithian's show in Cornwall many times. We're very similar in lots of ways. Stithian's, I understand, looking up on their website, started in the 1800s with various local people competing against other growing vegetables, raising cattle, etc. We started in 1847 as a result of a challenge between 2 farmers at the laying of the Melplash village church stone, and the result of that challenge is about which ploughman could create a better furrow than the other one. That was the start of the Melplash Show. 175 years we have been going. This is our anniversary. Apart from the war years, we have had a show every year. We attract 20-odd thousand people. It is, we think, a pretty special show. It's bigger, I think, than Stithian's. But we're much more than just a one-day show. I'd like to think we're our significant community organisation. In a minute, I'm going to ask Chris to say what he thinks about us. But we do lots of other things. Gardens competitions, farm competitions, flock competitions, young farmers, stock judging competitions. And of course, the hedging and ploughing, which replicates where we started. In addition to that, we've got a significant educational aspect of both the show and the society. At the show, we've had in the last few years a very significant new enterprise, Discover Farming, which is a huge success in teaching children all about aspects of where food comes from, how it's produced, etc. And then we got our bursary scheme, where we sponsor students in agriculture and related activities at college. And over the last 10 years or so since it's been running, we have given away over £250,000 to support students. So we are what I'd like to think a very significant West Dorset organisation. Our show's the last Thursday in August, 25th of August this year. You'd be very welcome to come. Chris is a member, so he's paid for his ticket. If you come, you're a guest, George, and I hope that doesn't conflict with parliamentary rules about declaring gifts from funny organisations such as us. I'd like to, the format of this evening is going to be, I'm going to ask Chris in a second just to say a few words. Then George, if you speak for sort of 20 minutes on the subjects that we kindly gave to you. And then our three panelists have got some questions which they are going to pose. And the viewers have also got questions which are coming in. And depending on how that all works out, I might raise those with you as well. So I hope that's okay. We recognise you may have to disappear and vote, in which case...
Yeah, we do. So Nigel, we're 3 minutes into an 8-minute vote. So I'm going to go now and vote while Chris gives you 2 minutes. And then he can go and vote, and I should be back by the time he's finished.
Splendid. That'll
that
work.
Makes sense. And then I can kick off and he can rejoin us.
That'll work, George. Thank you very much.
Sorry, we've only got a couple more of these, I think, but okay.
Yeah. The wonders of parliamentary democracy.
Over to Chris.
Chris, we might as well do your little bit. What I wanted you just to say...
Go on, Nigel, go on.
Sorry, what I wanted you to just to say is a bit about how important agriculture is to your constituency, and a little bit about the show's role in your view as a member, but also as a MP on its contribution to the West Dorset community.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to do a couple of things, if I may, Nigel. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute, but I wondered, as we've disrupted the evening so much, whether you'd actually like to see what we do when the bell goes. Don't forget your pass, George.
No,
so
well,
shall I just give you a little tour? I hope the Secretary of State for Transport won't mind me just chasing it. So I'm going to turn the video around so you can see where we're going. So we're upstairs at the moment, going down to the voting lobby. There are 8 consecutive votes at the moment, as George said, because there's been some opposition challenge to the Nationality and Borders Bill. And what we do is we come down the stairs to the lobby, and this is the as you can see is the Speaker's chair. I lobby to the right, which is here, and then there's no lobby to the left. So what I've basically got to do here, so this is the lobby where we're voting. Technology means, sorry, I'll hold it up. Technology means we swipe to record our vote now. So we record the vote. And then basically, this is the lobby here where all the MPs are. Oh, there, that's the member for the Isle of Wight, who's particularly keen to say hello. And then we basically go through the end, and I'll show you that in just a moment. In just a moment, and then basically come out the other end to be counted. So what I'll do in just a minute is show you that. But what I have to do for a moment is I just have to walk down the lobby. George is ahead of me by 2 minutes, so if you just give me a second, I'll be back with you in just a mo. So hold on just a minute.
Okay. Well, I don't think anybody thought we were going to have a tour of the House of Commons this evening in a Melplash webinar, but you know, first for everybody, first for everything. I'd like to think that the show are ahead of the game, that we can say that we had our tour of the House of Commons. I always wondered what they did when they actually went into the lobbies. I thought they just sort of chatted idly, but
no, we don't chat too idly, I'm afraid. Sorry about that.
Yeah, he's back. He's back.
But there's of course quite a few people here, and it's the same in both lobbies. So you have one in the of course the no lobby, and one in the I lobby. So there we are. Okay. So I'll call you in just a second.
Okay, we'll wait for you to come back, Chris. I hope, George, you're back. We can't see you at the moment.
That, Mr. President, that reminded me of Treasure Hunt with Anneka Rice all the years ago. Going through.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. Rather sort of. What was it? The Anneka challenges. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for him to get in the helicopter.
Yeah.
Have you been up to the Houses of Parliament before, Nigel?
I have actually. Yes, I have. I have once had drinks on the terrace. It was all very pleasant, and I didn't pay for them either. Anyway, Chris is back now. Hopefully, or he might be back.
Oh, here he is.
He's got to go up the stairs again, I presume.
Okay, yeah, so I'm back now. So I'm the other way. So basically, what we have here is walking through the library corridor here. Don't know if you can just see behind me. Go back round like the long way, back up to George's office, which will take a minute or two to get there, I think. Anyway, so sorry, it's a bit of a long way. I don't know if you can see here.
No, it's been fascinating, Chris. It's been fascinating. It's a real pleasure that we can do something slightly different. Yeah.
A bit quirky, yeah. So this is the corridor that goes down to the Speaker's office down at the end, and it mirrors the members' library, which is sort of just behind these cabinets here. These are all the records, like the old records of Hansard, some of the original copies of the official record of the House of Commons proceedings, and I think there's some Lords ones up there. But this corridor basically goes on for quite some way, as you can see. It's good exercise, although you wouldn't think it. I've put on a few pounds since I started this job.
This contributes heavily to your appropriate number of steps per day, then.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't record it. Unfortunately, though, I should do. It's an incentive for my own well-being, I think. Now, so I've basically come back to the end, and I'll be just coming back into the office in a minute. Nigel, you asked me at the beginning about me just to say a few words about the Melplash show, and I just wanted to say very briefly before George gets back that for me the Melplash show has played quite a role certainly in my life over the years, and I know that of my family's. Since a young boy, I've been coming to the Melplash show either with my uncle or with my dad, who is a beef farmer on the outskirts of Sherborne. And, you know, it's a show that, in my opinion, is a particularly wonderful show. It's probably one of the best small shows, at least in the Southwest, if not further afield. And I think what we have to offer and show, not just the rest of the region, but the nation as well, is a good thing. And I hope George is able to take some of that away. I have asked George to come. Of course, he's been to Bedminster, I think a little while before I was elected, George, if I remember. I refer to that in my maiden speech. Nigel, I'm going to hand over to George as we're here, because we're going to have to go down again in a minute. So I'll hand over to George to do the talking, and I'll fill in again in a minute.
Okay, thank you, Chris. George, if you could start, and if you have to take it, if you have to disappear, we'll understand, and we can then talk to Chris, or we can talk amongst ourselves for a few minutes. But that was really helpful, Chris. So, George, over to you for.
Okay, well, let me kick off and see how far we get. And I might have to do this in two chunks, and then we can resume. But probably actually after that, get into questions and a proper discussion, which I think is mainly what people want. The first thing to say, it's great to be able to join you tonight, and apologies again for the various delays, and great to hear about Chris's own connections with the Melplash show. You made the comparison with Stydians. That's one of the biggest one-day shows in the country. It is a really successful show in my area, and I can remember as a young man there showing our South Devon cattle at the Stydian show, and even younger than that, my father was a steward at the Royal Cornwall show, and I used to have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and ride in the car with him up there to do his duties on the on the gate and try and entertain myself for a very long day at the Royal Cornwall show. But some great memories of those shows, and the role of all of our county and those more local shows as well, is really important. And it was great, Nigel, to hear what you said about the work that it does, to support new people trying to come into the industry and training and skills and so on. At the beginning with your own comments, that's it's really good to see the agricultural societies up and down the country still playing such a lead role in that. The other thing to say is I did, as Chris said, the last time I visited his constituency is when Oliver Letwin was the MP there. And I can remember coming down, and it was right in the teeth of the sort of Brexit arguments that were going on, and trying to tell people what we were going to do on fisheries policy, and talking about the cod wars in the 1970s. And I don't know if he's still in the constituency, but there was a sort of retired captain of the Fisheries Protection Squadron who knew way more about the 1976 cod wars than I did, because he was right in the middle of it and had retired to Dorset and told me all about it. So it was a lesson in not thinking you know more than your audience when I came down on that occasion. But look, Chris has in his time here since he was elected has made a huge impact on Parliament, and in particular on some of our DEFRA issues, constantly in my ear on different issues related to agriculture in particular, and some of the issues we've got around the animal welfare bills. And as some of you will know, has been a champion for some improvements around slaughterhouse regulation, particularly as it relates to religious slaughter, which is, I think, I've always felt as an important issue that we should do better at. But time and time again, Parliament tends to duck the issue and put it into the too difficult box. And I think it's quite telling when you've got an MP who's not shy about trying to grapple with difficult, contentious issues and trying to do the right thing and make progress with them. So I wanted to sort of commend the work that Chris has done, both for rural communities, but also his willingness to take on and tackle what some people regard as quite tricky and difficult issues during his time since he was elected. And of course, for the newly elected MPs last time around in 2019, it's been a very a difficult start for the first few years because of the lockdowns, the absence from Parliament, the fact that the parliamentary party didn't have the opportunity to gel in the usual way. But Chris has really, I think, really excelled during that time. Now, I wanted to say just a little bit, first of all, about the current context in terms of the international situation and food supply and the impacts of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which I know are quite high on the minds at the moment of many in the farming community. And the first thing to say is that as we came out of the pandemic, supply chains were pretty much all over the shop, in that everything was in the wrong place. Shipping had been horrendously disrupted. There were shortages in many different areas. Prices were already on the rise. There was a peak and a spike in demand for LNG gas in Asia that had already driven gas prices to new highs and caused quite a bit of fragility in things like the carbon dioxide market, and indeed an initial spike in fertilizer prices around Christmas and the New Year, taking it to around £600 a tonne, when £250 a tonne was previously seen as the norm. And obviously the Russian invasion of Ukraine has caused a further spike in gas prices. And because the manufacture of ammonium nitrate fertilizer depends so much on very large quantities of gas, there's a direct correlation between the gas price and the fertilizer price. And that's causing some real challenges for farmers at the moment and a real issue for confidence as they look at the season ahead. Now, on the other side of the coin, because British intelligence had predicted that Russia would probably do this and had been doing so since around Christmas, we'd stood up a group to think about the impact on food security should this eventuality arise. And the primary direct impact of the disruption caused by this invasion is on sunflower oil, where Ukraine is the world's biggest producer and actually provides us with about 60 to 70% of our sunflower oil production. In most other areas, the impacts are predominantly on prices rather than overall supply, because on wheat, although it's a significant producer, it's a relatively small proportion of overall global production. The other thing, though, is obviously the impact for farmers as they're feeling it is, first of all, fertilizer prices going up to very high, prohibitively high levels. Secondly, the cost of diesel rising sharply. And thirdly, energy costs, which are particularly pertinent for people like the dairy sector and some others as well. And then that's in the context of a labour shortage anyway, so rising labour costs, and then other inputs and raw materials also rising because they're also largely influenced by the gas price. So there's undoubtedly very, very strong upward pressure on input costs and variable costs for many, many farm businesses at the moment, which I recognise. But on the other side, we're also seeing, obviously some food price inflation. And that's obviously a concern for government because we're worried about the cost of living and household expenditure and people's ability to pay their electricity bills, as well as the rent and the council tax and their food bills and so on. So that's a concern for us. But from where we are at the moment, there isn't really an answer other than to allow there to be some changes on food prices for the time being, so that farmers are able to pass through those additional input costs that they've got. Now, what we expect at the moment is that on some sectors like broiler chicken and on pigs, there's some quite big players in those sectors. And although pigs has been distressed for a long time, many of them have aligned contracts linked to cost of production, and they should automatically get a pass through of those costs through the supply chain, albeit sometimes with a bit of a time lag. And when it comes to the arable sector, those growing wheat, particularly milling wheat, they're going to probably see quite good prices for this current crop that they've got in the ground when they harvest it later in the summer. And the crops come out of the winter in quite good condition. And many of those arable farms will have bought fertilizer, albeit at quite a high price, but prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so for the current season, they're probably set in a reasonably good condition, reasonably good position. The really big challenge, though, is what happens on the next growing season, and whether people will have the confidence to grow and drill a crop of wheat during the autumn for next season, when they could face high fertilizer prices, but some uncertainty about what they would get for their wheat. And it's a very uncertain time because the millers and the bread manufacturers are not going to commit to a high price yet when they fear that things could turn against them and go the other way. So they're going to sit it out for a while. There's no getting away from that. And likewise, farmers are going to be reluctant to commit to sow a crop in the autumn, when at the moment they see high prevailing fertilizer costs, but not necessarily any guarantee on the wheat price. So it's probably going to be one of those standoffs for which there's no short-term solution due to the international turbulence we're seeing. But probably in around June or July, there'll be a moment of truth when either the bread manufacturers will break and accept that they're going to have to pay a higher price in order to get the crop in the ground, or we'll see things adjust the other way and some of those input costs coming down and things will recalibrate. And it's very hard to tell at the moment exactly what's going to happen. But I do understand that for a lot of farmers at the moment, they're facing what they would regard as quite a highly leveraged risk as they think about the next growing season, particularly on the arable sector. The final thing I just want to touch on is on some of the other livestock sectors, on dairy and beef and sheep. The prices on lamb are at record highs at the moment at around $5.60 a kilo, and that means that they've enjoyed relatively good years of financial performance over the last few years. So they're in quite a resilient position, but they've also got some rising costs, obviously. And then on beef and on dairy, there's this other challenge that they've got typically some feed costs that are going to rise because of the rise in feed wheat. And again, in some cases, uncertainty about whether they can pass that through. Now, we know that the farm gate price for milk is currently, on the spot market going through 40 pence per litre. There's some projections that in the third quarter that could rise to 50 pence per litre. So I think by and large, dairy farmers, in the West Country will find that they're able to recover their increased input costs through that increased farm gate price. But as always with dairy, it's going to be quite a mixed picture. And some of those who are on aligned contracts, because of the time lag again, they may find that it takes a while before they see the price increase that corresponds to the increased input costs they've got now. So it's an uncertain, anxious time for farming. I do understand that, caused by this international turbulence, but it's going to be really, really important that as a nation we face down Putin, ensure that he fails in this, and ensure that Ukraine comes out of the other side of this and can continue to, and they're determined to get their crop in the ground for this year. But also, important beyond that, that we relearn some important lessons, which is that our food security as a nation is dependent on two things. It's dependent on open markets around the world, so that we can, for instance, at the moment, move wheat to some of those North African countries that were previously very dependent on Ukraine and Russia. But it's also very important that we recognize the absolute centrality of domestic food production towards our national resilience and our national food security. And this is a second reminder we've had of this in as many years, because even during COVID, there was a period of a few months where we had genuine concerns that the world might turn in on itself and that we might actually get countries putting in place export bans on food. And that really brought into quite sharp focus our vulnerabilities as a nation when we were dependent for so many goods on imports. And so it's very important, as we think about food security, that we think about those two components of it. Globally open markets, so that we can move food to where it's needed, but also a resilient domestic production to give us that national resilience that we need. I think, Nigel, that's probably enough for me by way of an opening, and you can probably hear the bells going again, which is the bane of our lives here, because it means there's another wretched vote that we're going to have to go to. So I might, if I can at this stage, pause there and return in 2 minutes, and then you
George,
can
I think
yourself the questions.
No, I think that's fantastic. If you disappear, and Chris, are you going to disappear as well now? If so, if you then come back. I'm just waiting, everybody, to see what.
Yeah, Chris has just suggested that we wait a couple more minutes, because then we can run through at the last minute when there isn't a queue to get through the corridor. And I know you've had a real time guided tour of the chaos of a voting lobby with Chris going through just now. So we'll stay on for a couple of minutes.
Okay, John. What I'll do then is I won't ask our panelists to raise some of their questions, because I know that they're quite detailed in some respects. But can I put a very quick question to you, which has been put to me, saying cash flow is going to be a real challenge, particularly for tenant farmers with high input costs. Can the Secretary of State recommend that banks support farmers needing more working capital?
Yes, I think it's a very good point. And I'm planning to meet the banks, first of all, to give them an update on the policy trajectory we've got for the rest of this year around, in particular, the sustainable farming incentive, but also things like the animal health and welfare pathway as well. But the other important area here is when it comes to cash flow. We're looking in particular at the BPS payment this year, and whether we may need to sort of flex the timings of some of that. We've not made any final decisions on that. As you know, it would normally come in December. Under previous EU laws, it was unlawful to pay it prior to the beginning of December. But we are giving some thought now that it's effectively funded by the Treasury as to whether we could play around with some of the timings on that to ensure that we can even out some of those cash flow issues that some businesses will face.
Another quick question, which may not be a quick answer, I'm sure, but the question of productive farmland being taken out for other uses, e.g. solar, etc. And we have this dichotomy between these two requirements. And what are your views on that, and which potentially should take precedence?
Well, I'm generally, if I'm honest, an opponent of field scale solar. I support it on building roofs, and I think there's huge amounts that could be done on that front. But a few years ago, in 2016, I pressed very hard within government to change the planning guidance on solar, so that the best and most versatile land, that's grade 3B and above, there should be a presumption against having solar farms on that land. Now, I am conscious, I've had quite a lot of MPs come to me in the last 6 months saying that provision I put in place doesn't seem to be holding, in that there are now quite a lot of new, very large developments proposed in these areas. I mean, in some cases, they can still do some grazing around them, but generally speaking, I think once you lose land to solar, you've pretty much lost it for good. So some of your members might like it, I don't know, but I'm afraid I'm generally not a huge fan of field scale solar. I think it's a bit of a blight on the landscape. I'm sure that once it's finished, there'll be other sort of it'll be treated as a brownfield site. There'll be other kinds of development that happen there rather than a reversion to farming. And I do think there's a bit of a concern about losing good agricultural land in that way.
Well, that's the key point that was trying to be made, is about this loss of good quality agricultural land, and surely that should have an overriding impact when considering such uses.
Exactly, I agree. Well, I'm glad you agree, Nigel, because I know there are a lot of farmers who actually would probably quite like the income from a solar farm, but we do need to try and balance these competing needs. Now, on that basis, we probably should go and vote now, because otherwise we'll miss it altogether. But
well,
we'll be back in about 3 minutes.
That's fine. Our panelists can ruminate on what you've been saying so far. That's fine. We'll see you in a few minutes.
Make sure you press the right button.
Right, gentlemen. Gentlemen, do you want to either talk about that, what so far you've heard? Any thoughts on what you've heard so far?
I guess I'm just wondering what the food strategy is, and in terms of land use, it's not just solar farms that are the issue, it's land being bought up and turned into, and put over to environmental schemes that's taken out of production. So it's a bigger issue than just the implantation of solar farms that is taking agricultural land out.
When he comes back, Alistair, in terms of your questions, you may want to press him on that, perhaps.
Well, I think Andrew's got a question on that, haven't you, Andrew?
I was going to ask him about the domestic food situation, whether there should be more of an emphasis on domestic food, and maybe we row back a little bit, or maybe pause on the greening that's going on, the rewilding, the planting of trees on fields. Maybe we should actually just push our production a little bit forward, because obviously fertilizers are going to be used less and less, so the volume of food that we're producing as a country, I know we're sufficient in several foods, but there's quite a lot that we're not. And the thing is, if we're not sufficient, we'll end up importing it from other countries which don't have the same standards as us. I know that they're signing trade deals at the moment with India and Australia, and I wanted to ask him about some of the trade deals that have happened, because you can bet your bottom dollar that they'll be using food to get to our market of 63 million people that we have. Lots of other countries want to get their food into us, and we'll be used as a bargaining tool, us in agriculture.
We have a question that's been sent in, which relates to what he's been talking about. I mean, perhaps one of you could work it into what you're going to ask, sorry, I'm just going to find that question. The question is, given the possible effects of war in Ukraine, will the food and agriculture sector be prioritized for access to energy, fuel and fertilizer? So, good question from one of our members. I wonder if you can think about that when you come on to asking your questions, whether you've got an opportunity to weave that in. I know you can all see the questions, can't you, panelists? If you see the one I'm talking about, if you could, that would be helpful. So what I'm going to do is, when he comes back, is I'm going to go straight into the questions, hopefully. Now, bearing in mind the time, I'm going to suggest perhaps we limit the questions to start with to 2 each, and then we can go back to your third question, depending on how the time works out, if you're happy with that. Because I am keen that some of the questions that have been submitted are also put to him. So of your 3 questions, if you can all think which of the 2 you're going to ask to start with, and we'll see how the conversation goes from there. Happy with that, gentlemen?
Yep.
Can we also then look at, you can see the other questions that have been put forward by those viewing. Is there anything on those questions that you want to weave in? I've given you a clue on one, or is there anything particular you think I should ask as a separate question?
I've got a question about the sort of work, the labour shortages that he's already referred to, and I see George has got a question that I could sort of tag on to the question I had.
Yes, the question that's been put is, what will government do to help us attract people into agriculture? We need to attract people who have dynamism and innovative and help them build skills through their careers. Well, Alistair, if you'd pick that one up, that would be good. The other question, the very short question, how does the Secretary of State view the fact that supermarkets are dragging their feet in terms of paying pig, poultry and dairy farmers a fair price? Andrew, that's sort of related to what you're going to talk about, isn't it?
Yes, I was going to touch on milk contracts and that's right, milk prices at the moment and that sort of thing.
Okay, well, Chris is back, so presumably George may be shortly behind him.
He will shortly be behind. Yeah, I was just going to say reference to the supermarkets and so on. Oh, George is here, so he's going to answer it, and I'll come back. But he knows full well my views on the grocery adjudicator and how I think they're not very effective. But I'll let George keep going.
George, what we would like to do now, if we may, is I'm going to introduce the 3. Or let them introduce themselves, my 3 panelists. They've got some questions which we've discussed amongst ourselves, and I've also tried, whilst you've been away, to pick up some of the other questions that have already been sent in. So, Andrew, over to you. A little bit introduction of who you are and then your questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. Hello, George, if I may. My name is Andrew Frampton, a farm down here in West Dorset. Our family have been here for about 200 years farming. We milk 175 dairy cows, and we sell our milk to Barber's cheese. It makes the cheese, and also black cow vodka. So the perfect sort of things for parties. What I'd like to ask is basically about the dairy industry at the moment. You're an advocate of milk contract reform, and you want to get rid of discretionary milk pricing, because I think you said the market doesn't work for farmers. But the number and the speed of positive price rises over the past few months clearly shows that the market is working for farmers, and that a fixed price, fixed term contract, the sort that DEFRA envisages, would have been an utter disaster. Have you therefore changed your mind on milk contracts at all?
Well, I never actually believed that it should only be a fixed price, fixed term contract. What I have argued, though, is that it's very important that the contractual basis on which the price is calculated is clear. And so you either have the case that you're open to the sort of spot market and there's a limited time commitment, but the price, is set and revised quite frequently, or you have a system where there's a clear formula that's linked to cost of production, and everybody understands where they stand. So it's not to be prescriptive about what the price formula should be, just to say that there should be a price formula. And the reason I think that's important is that what we have seen in the past is prices can be sometimes slow to rise on an upswing and quite fast to fall when things go in the other direction. And I think linked to that, there's been a long-standing problem that when processors are competing with very large retailers to try to get business, it's often easier for them to, to dump a cost reduction or a price reduction back on the farmers than it is to stand their ground against supermarket buyers. And what we need to get to is a situation where a processor says to a supermarket, I cannot go there, I cannot do what you're telling me to do because I've got contractual obligations to my own suppliers, my own farmers who supply me, and I'm not going to breach those, and I can't breach them because it would be unlawful for me to do so. And if you have that across the board and everyone's bound by contracts like that, well, then they will set the right contracts to get the farmers to supply them. And they will also, make sure that they stand their ground against the supermarket buyers. So it's not about saying there should be fixed prices and fixed terms. It's just saying that they should be clear about the way in which the price formula is calculated if it's going to be for the long term. And it shouldn't just be down to a sort of paternalistic, and I've heard this from dairy companies, oh, well, it's not in our interest to hurt our farmers. We'll always look after them and see them right. But I don't think that's enough for farmers to be able to rely upon. And some companies have been, historically better than others. So that you've got some good, family-run businesses in cream and cheese that actually behave honourably. You've also got a few other companies that behave less honourably, to be honest. And I just think making sure there's clarity about the contractual terms is what it's about, not prescribing what they should be.
If I could come back, supermarkets seem to have had the power over particularly the dairy industry for a number of years. And at last, it seems the tide is changing. We actually have a product now that the public really wants, and there's a shortage and they're craving after. What really's broken the back of the dairy industry, I think, over the years, is that a lot of supermarkets have discounted milk as a loss leader, and no government has ever stepped in to sort of value the product, to give it a real sort of premium stand. But when I know you sort of stepped in the market to stop fat and sugars and salts being put into foods. Why has no government ever intervened to sort of protect the dairy industry as a nutritious liquid milk?
Well, arguably they have over the years, in that they had, production support, and then cow premiums, and then quota systems, all of which were designed to try to manage the market. None of them managed the market particularly effectively, and led to all sorts of weird, quasi-financial assets in quota and so on that caused a lot of disruption. So I think there were attempts to try and manage the market in that way, but they weren't very successful. The key thing, for me is it shouldn't really matter to us whether supermarkets are making a very fine margin on their milk or no margin at all. What matters is that basically the farmers themselves are getting the right kind of return for their milk. And you're right, we're seeing that market adjust now, that the price of milk in most cases is going past 40 pence per litre at the moment. And, under some estimates is likely to go to 50 pence per litre by the third quarter. So we're seeing some quite significant, adjustments there, which reflect the fact that you've got those growing input costs, and processors are realising they're going to have to pay that money to get the milk.
That's true, George. But the farm consultancy Promar, they've said that the milk price, that the cost of production is going to go up 9.2p. Our feed costs have gone up 49%. Our energy costs 48%. Our fertiliser costs 100%. So, I know the milk price is rising, but in real terms, we're no better off than we were, say, a year ago before all this happened. So I don't know what you can do about it.
Yeah, I want to say that we've been saved by the
I'll
bell.
be back in.
They've been
I'm afraid
summoned
we
again.
literally have been, but this is the last one.
Running
So there's
scared.
going to be no more escaping tricky questions. So sorry.
Chris,
about
do
this.
you want to leave us and then do your?
Yeah, if you give me a minute, and I'll call you back. I'll be back in just a minute.
That's fine. That's fine.
All right. Thank you.
That's fine. So, Andrew, what do you think of what he said so far on your points?
Well, it's a sort of political answer, isn't it? They're not.
Do you want to press him on it then?
Well, what has annoyed me is that with the supermarkets, they have just let them sort of run wild with their pricing and devaluing our product. They even this week, Marks and Spencer's, one of the premium English brands, UK brands, has actually cut the price of milk to compete with Lidl and Aldi. They're just using us as a tool to get people into their supermarkets to buy other stuff, and it's just devaluing our product. And milk now, a litre of milk is nearly the same price as water. You know, for years, water, which falls out of the sky and comes out of the ground, has almost been twice as much. So finally, we've caught up with it. But they're just, you know, we're not getting the support that we need. They're just allowing them to sort of.
I think, Andrew, therefore, we've got to press him on this, because we don't want to just have a platitude that he says the answer that we think he's going to say. So I'd be very happy that you come back again and say, although obviously we've got a time constraint that we don't want to spend all evening talking about this, but it would be really helpful, I think, to people who are watching, and indeed from everybody else's perspective, that you try and nail him down a little bit more succinctly on this point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Give you, sorry, Jim.
Yeah, Kite Consulting announced today that the cost is, it should be, we need 47p now, not 40p from the supermarkets. We need 47p looking forward to the third quarter. And yeah, they're just lagging too slowly, and we are just carrying all this cash. And yeah, and it's how many dairy farmers are going to want to carry that amount of cash. It's just not, yeah, it's just not business, really.
We are going to press, Chris, if you're listening, we are going to press
Yes,
George.
yeah.
We are going to press George
Good.
about this milk
Good.
price issue.
He's been pressed by me many a time about it, so don't be afraid about that.
Oh no, we're not
I've
going to be
also-
afraid.
I've also pressed him about the grocery adjudicator, supposedly the regulator for people, organisations like supermarkets, and there needs to be a bit, well, a lot more clout, I think, given to them. One of the things that became clear to me probably about 18 months ago is that some supermarkets, Sainsbury's is a good example, that had threatened to tear up milk contracts with farmers unless they sold them 20 or 25% of their calves. That's the kind of tactics that we've seen from some supermarkets. So yeah, no, George is quite clear on my views, and he's just literally come back. So I think he'll be able to answer the question for you. He's here.
Okay.
You've got some extra steps in, George. Don't worry, your health.
We did. So just
Yes.
on Andrew's point, which just to prove that I wasn't trying to dodge it, it is the case that we've seen those increase in, you know, in input costs on dairy, and those are obviously being passed through. But I suppose you've got to look at it in the overall context that when I first became a minister in 2014, we quite quickly had a really difficult period for dairy, which Andrew will remember in 2015, when dairy prices really did go onto the floor, and many were getting 16 or 18 pence, or sometimes even less, when they were selling in a market at distressed prices. We've sort of seen things recover, you know, the last few years to an average of around 32 pence per litre, and it's remained fairly stable at that. An average dairy farm income's recovered to about 100,000 a year, and pretty much stayed at that level, you know, for some time. So they've had a better period over the last 5-6 years than they, you know, had done, you know, prior to that. And although they've got those increased costs, obviously the price of milk now looks like it's going to go from 32 pence to 50 pence, which should help recover many of those costs. And the analysis we've done so far, you know, suggests that the dairy farmers will actually, you know, still do reasonably well if those prevailing higher prices do materialize. You know, the big risk obviously is there could be a time lag in some cases depending on the contract. So ironically, those that are on some of those aligned contracts linked to cost of production might actually find that their prices are slower to respond, you know, to the market, but then they've done generally, you know, better than others on a sort of more market orientated price over the last few years.
Andrew, do you want
Yeah,
to finish on this one and then move on to your next question?
Okay, but I think you've got to remember that if farming is not profitable, it's not sustainable. So, and at the moment, with all these costs that are going up, and there's such a lag, and we, there's not enough capital really to sort of help get through it all at the moment. With the feed costs, as I said, up 49%. But what does hurt is the supermarkets, just devaluing our products. I don't know if you're allowed to interfere with their marketing or their markets, but I know that you've interfered with, as I said before, with salt content and sugar content in food. Why can't you have a protection on, say, nutritious foods, vegetables as well, and root crops, as well as dairy, where they can't sell it because it just devalues, and we'll end up having cheap imports coming across from other countries that don't have our same standards, and that's the biggest worry about that. We'll start to get imports coming across that aren't made to the same husbandry and the same standards as we have.
Yeah, I mean the thing on dairy. So that when it comes to imports and particularly in the context of trade agreements, there are some particular concerns around the beef industry, which is a sensitive sector and where, we can't compete with certain countries that have ranching systems. When it comes to dairy, there isn't really a country in the world that can compete with European countries, and we can compete with Denmark and France and Germany. And when it comes to liquid milk, as you'll know, Andrew, it's pretty, we're 100% self-sufficient. It's not easy to import liquid milk successfully. So the liquid milk market is always going to have a strong gravitational pull to domestic production. And when you look at cheeses and dairy products, it's actually one of our main export offensive interests, in that neither the United States nor Canada nor Australia nor any of the others big agricultural countries can actually compete with us in terms of the quality of our cheeses. So there are some good opportunities there in that trade, but there are some, we've got some vulnerabilities undoubtedly when it comes to things like beef.
Andrew, I'm going to change the format slightly because I'm mindful of the time, and I don't know how much time we're all going to want to spend doing this. But Jim, can I come over to you then to introduce yourself, as you haven't said very much, and neither has Alistair. So I'm going to do one question each. Jim, if you'd like to introduce yourself and ask your first question.
Yeah, good evening, Secretary of State. I'm James Bowditch, and the fourth generation mixed farmer in West Dorset with dairy, beef, sheep and arable. Land is being taken out of food production to sequester more carbon. There is a looming food crisis due to the European war and a huge opportunity for British agriculture to be more productive and self-sufficient. Can you confirm you are commissioning a report into food security and what British agriculture can do to be less reliant on imports?
Yes, so we've got an obligation under the Agriculture Act, which we introduced last year, as you'll know, that every 3 years we have to commission a review of our food security. The first of those reports was published in December. It's a very detailed, comprehensive analysis worth a read for those that are interested in this. It runs to several hundred pages. It looks at our production to supply ratio in a whole range of different areas. And it's a relatively positive story overall, in that for the foods that we can produce in this country, we are on average about 75% self-sufficient. Now that's lower than some agricultural exporting nations like the United States or Australia or even Germany or France. But by historical standards for the UK, it's quite high, because it was around 30% in the late 19th century, about 40% in the interwar period. We learned an important but quite costly lesson as a result of that. But since the turn of the century, we've had around 75% self-sufficiency for the foods that we can produce, and that's remained quite stable. We've seen increasing self-sufficiency on poultry and on pigs and on soft fruit and even on top fruit. So the really interesting thing is that the the sectors that have been most successful and where we've seen the greatest growth in output have actually been the sectors that have traditionally not been subsidized and are more market orientated. But nevertheless, on some of those other important sectors, we're about 90% self-sufficient in beef. We produce, as I said earlier, more milk than we consume. We produce more sheep than we consume. We're one of the world's biggest exporters of sheep, after just Australia and New Zealand, who are obviously, very, very big global players in that area. So the overall picture is quite positive. We're internationally competitive in the vast majority of sectors, including in dairy, and we've got some quite a resilient food supply chain as well. But that's not to say that we are complacent, and there are areas where we could do better, particularly on horticulture and glasshouse production. So that's an area that we're looking at. There's no reason why we couldn't displace some of the imports that currently come, for instance, from the Netherlands, and that's an area that we're looking at. And it's important as well that we the key thing in all of this, in my view, is to pursue profitable agriculture. And if you have a vibrant, profitable sector, then a lot of other things take care of themselves. And that's more important than looking at the other way around and saying, what's the correct production to supply ratio for any given product at any given point in history, because it will change over time, depending on a range of factors. But as I said, overall, it's quite a positive picture. We are going to have a food strategy that we are publishing in the next month or so that will draw quite heavily on some of that analysis in the food security review, and also talk about the importance of our food manufacturing industry to the levelling up agenda and its contribution to the economy around the country. And obviously our food manufacturing sector is highly dependent on successful agriculture as well. There's a real interdependency there.
Thank you.
Jim, do you want to come back on that, or any other comments?
No, I think we just feel like the agricultural land base is getting pulled in all directions at the moment, with an over-reliance on fuel from abroad, and we need to get our carbon usage back under control. With rewilding issues and lots of land getting took out of production, we've got to make sure the public money that's going into the Elden scheme is not just going to rewild the countryside for estates and landowners that actually don't need it, but we need to look after our country's food supply so we don't start dragging it in from around the west of the world and exporting all the environmental problems for agriculture to another part of the world. And I just feel that there's a big opportunity for the next round of the white paper to look after the farmers of the future, and less so for the people who have bought farmland as a tax dodge.
That covers it. That's a statement, perhaps a little more than a question, George. But over to you.
Well, there is but behind there, there's a serious question which we're looking at in quite a bit of detail, and that is the correlation between land use and agricultural land and agricultural output. And it isn't a direct correlation. And so 2/3 of our agricultural output comes from about 1/3 of the land area. And that's because you've got sectors like pigs and poultry and horticulture, which use very, very little land, but obviously are responsible for a big chunk of our agricultural output. And then you've obviously got huge diversity between, a moorland area where there's a few grazing sheep, where your agricultural output's already very low. And then you've got, some of your intensive horticultural production like carrots and other veg, where it's a different magnitude of scale in terms of output per hectare. So it's not a straight line correlation between land area and agricultural output. And the other thing is, of course, we mustn't forget that the BPS scheme, the area subsidy, is not actually a subsidy for food production at all. It was quite explicitly a decoupled payment. It's a subsidy for owning or renting land. It's unlinked to food production. And so what we actually have in many parts of the country is land that's not really being particularly actively farmed, where people are occupying it in order to collect the subsidy but aren't doing much with it. And so as we unwind that, I can see a future where, yes, we'll have some land use change in some areas, and there'll be a clear policy, and we will support that because we need some of that. But then there'll be other land at the moment where you've got very low levels of agricultural production because people are just occupying the land to collect the subsidy for land occupation. And once you remove that incentive for them to do so, there'll be other land that comes back into production. So we're about to do quite a piece of work looking at this whole land use issue. But it's important to recognise that the Common Agricultural Policy has not supported food production for at least 20 years.
Right. We'll come back to you, Jim, in a minute. Alistair, as you have been sitting rather patiently, again, if you could introduce yourselves and your first question, please.
Oh, good evening, George. I'm a veterinary surgeon, a registered specialist in cattle health and production. I work in a large independent farm-only vet practice based locally. Outside my practice, I spend about 50% of my time performing consultancy work across the dairy supply chain, and that results in my visiting a lot of dairy farms across the United Kingdom, so not just in this area. I'm also co-developer of the OIE registered Empflex bovine TB antibody test, so I have a strong background in TB as well. My first question is actually something you've touched on earlier on, which is labour shortage. I think probably my biggest concern, and certainly probably the number one, I think, real and present danger for the agricultural industry and certainly the dairy industry is a lack of labour supply. And I can think of a number of farms that have actually packed in because of their inability to maintain and recruit labour. It's causing an immense amount of stress. Clearly things have got worse since the changes in immigration rules or whatever. What are you intending to do about that to try and fix this real problem?
So the first thing is my priority focus on this, for understandable reasons, has been to get a seasonal agricultural workers scheme, which I've now secured, and we've had some conversations and discussions with the Home Office on that over the last couple of years. But we've now got a scheme that's going to run for at least 3 years that gives us 30,000 seasonal agricultural workers to come in for up to 6 months. And that'll run for at least, as I said, 3 years and probably be renewed after that, is the reality. And the reason that's been the priority is we've had a seasonal agricultural worker scheme in this country since the Second World War. It was always an important feature of that seasonal work, because in an era of low unemployment, you just you're not going to get people to take seasonal work when they could get a full-time job, and that's always been the case. Now, it's slightly different when it comes to certain elements of food processing, particularly meat processing, fish processing, and indeed some of those other roles on farms, dairy farms and so on, because actually the reliance on East European labour is a much more recent phenomenon. It only really developed after 2004, when we had the big Polish migration. And even then there was a time lag, and it was really only as some of those Polish and Czech workers who'd come in to work, first of all, in horticulture, started to drift into full-time roles on farms, that they started to displace roles that were traditionally filled by people who sort of lived in rural areas and had grown up in rural areas. So it's the interesting challenge is whether in some of those areas, some of those more full-time roles, whether you can get the local market readjusting to start to take those again. Now, I know I've run a farm business. I know how challenging it is to get staff to do some of these roles. I know it's a challenge, but equally, in things like meat processing, some of those meat processors had abandoned shift patterns that supported, for instance, young parents with children at school. They used to accommodate shift patterns that enabled them to drop their children off at school and pick them up. Those over time basically got displaced by East European labour on a different shift pattern. A lot of them are now looking at rekindling some of those more traditional shift patterns. I think we will see quite a bit of that in some of these other food sectors. But it's also an issue that we are going to have a review on and that we're looking at as part of our food strategy.
Can I pick up on that, George, because there is a question that's been sent in whilst you've been talking, which is related to this, but not so much in terms of short-term employment issues, but longer term. And the question is, and this is related obviously to the work that the society do in promoting education in agricultural issues. So the question is, what will government do to help us attract people into agriculture in the long term? We need to attract people who have dynamism and are innovative and help them build skills through their careers.
Yes, so one of the things we are doing is establishing a new agriculture and horticulture institute, which builds on a proposal that had been around a few years ago for a national agricultural college. And that's all about continuous career development and trying to move, more people who might be on a level 2 qualification through to level 3 and beyond, and to get that stronger sense of career progression. So we have got some work and some thinking going on around skills and to try to bring back a bit more credibility as well to some of the qualifications. So, there was a time when, I did an HND in commercial horticulture, and at that point in the 1990s, an HND, higher national diploma, had quite a bit of credibility in the industry as an applied but quite a high level qualification. Over time, I think there's been too much chopping and changing of qualifications and too many qualifications, and they've actually lost a lot of their significance and meaning. So I think there is a piece to do around skills, and we're working with industry on that. And the other thing is to try to support new entrants, and we've got a group that's working on an offer for new entrants. We want to try and revitalise the county farm model, but possibly also bring some of the private estates into that thinking as well, and try to have much more of a sort of incubator model for new people wanting to set out in business, give them business mentoring, give them business support to try to get them started for the first few years, and then have a plan to sort of progress them on to other private estates so that they can rent a holding thereafter. So I'm a great believer that getting fresh blood and new thinking back into the industry is going to be really important, and so we are doing some work in that area.
Okay, Andrew, I think back to you again. You're on mute, Andrew, sorry.
Sorry, yes. Minister, last week, the AHDB had a report that said sustainable farming initiative in its current form will fall short of offsetting expected direct payment losses. I know you've been oversubscribed on the current application. I think you've put it up to 48 million from 17. It's a fantastic scheme, really supportive of it. But do you think it goes far enough?
Yeah, so I mean, the important thing is that the SFIs alone is not there to be a direct replacement for the entire BPS. There's two things to say. One is we're on a journey from the old scheme to the new. And so we're making a reduction of 15% to the BPS payment, which, equates to, roughly something like 32, 33 pounds per hectare. We're offering people the ability to come back in and get anything from 27 to 58 pounds per hectare for doing the sustainable farming incentive on soils. Some of this is work that some farmers are doing already around green cover crops and so on. So for some, they won't have to change very much in order to qualify for that. Others will need to change their approach a bit if they want to qualify, but it's a choice for them about whether they do or they don't. The other thing to say is we've increased the payment rates on both countryside stewardship and the equivalent rates in the SFI by about 30% over and above what they would have been under the old EU scheme. So we've simultaneously signalled that quite a generous uplift in payments on countryside stewardship, try to get more people into that. We're currently approaching half of all farmers in a countryside stewardship scheme now, and we want that to get higher. We want to just keep driving those participation rates. So it's not just the SFI, it's also countryside stewardship, where we've also increased payment rates. And then the third thing is, as you indicated, we've also got a payment for farm productivity. We had 5,000 applications. It was massively oversubscribed. So we've just increased the budget from 17 million to 48 million. And these are far less restrictive than the old EU ones used to be. They've been popular with farmers. It's a small grant scheme for technology, and thousands of farmers are about to benefit from that because of the increase in the budget we put into it. And the final thing is, so for those in the livestock sector like yourself, we are introducing a new animal health and welfare pathway, starting with an ability for farmers to claim around £500 a year for an annual vet visit to help them put together a more strategic plan for the health of their herd of cattle or flock of sheep. And that's all about trying to make sure that we tackle some of the sort of endemic animal health issues that we know can be a drag on financial performance for some businesses, by making sure that you don't just call the vet out when you've got a calving crisis in the middle of the night, but you actually have a vet to do something more strategic once a year and help the farmer put together a plan to improve the animal health of their holding and therefore improve their profitability. So I think you can't just look at the SFI in isolation and say, is this the new BPS? It's one component of that. And it's only the first installment of that. Next year, we're going to have payments for hedgerows. And so farmers in parts of the country, possibly like Dorset, where they've still kept their hedges and have knocked them all down, will be able to claim, probably a per metre payment for the hedges that they've got for managing them in a particular way. And we're also looking at integrated pest management to try and support, lower pesticide use and other complementary techniques as well. And so it's only the beginning. And the only way we could have gone faster to make it a bigger payment would be to cut the BPS faster. And that's not what we said we would do. So, we've always been clear this is going to be an evolution. We want to gradually phase out the BPS as we roll out different components of the new policy.
Andrew, do you have a follow-up to that? Because I do have a question that's been sent in on a related subject, if I can use that one.
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
George, the question is, what steps are you going to take to assure SFI options are practical and good value for money to encourage farmer uptake? And will you commit to putting in place an effective means to hear farmer feedback and make the necessary programme changes?
Yes. So what we're doing with the entire policy, including on the SFIs, having an approach that we call co-design, where we've actually got a number of farmers that are on the programme helping us put together things that'll work. And so, for instance, on the SFI, one of the things that's emerged from that is something I've been pushing for a while, and actually farmers have supported, which is to say there shouldn't be an application window. And those of you who have to do your BPS application will know the kind of horror and fear of having in April and May, the busiest months of the year, scurry around trying to fill out your application form and get it lodged, worrying that they might have got lost and the RPA might not have it, worrying that you might not have clicked the right button, or maybe something went wrong, or you didn't fill out the right section of the right form, and that someone will say down the line that you're therefore not eligible for your payment. That constant fear we want to remove, and instead have a rolling window where people can apply to join the SFI at any time of the year that suits them. It might be in June, but if they're too busy in June, they can do it in September, and they'll get their first payment 2 or 3 months after they enroll on the scheme, and then they'll just keep getting a quarterly payment until they come off the scheme. And this is quite a groundbreaking thing, rather than the sort of EU concept of application windows and deadlines, and then the horror of missing deadlines or having appeals and so on. We can remove that and just have people enroll when it suits them. And that's a great example of getting that farmer engagement in the design of the new schemes. And our general approach on this is to take the view that we do really on tax. When you fill out your tax return, there isn't actually an HMRC person in there checking every last little thing you're doing and trawling through your bank statements and your income. A lot of it is taken on trust, but then there's a degree of surveillance to make sure they do pick up things. And so there's always the risk that if you lie on your tax return and you're not straight on your tax return, that you'll get found out and there'll be a problem. And generally that works quite well in that, particularly when you're dealing with businesses, people do, declare their income and they put in place the right procedures to do that, and they do things the right way. And we want to start taking some of that kind of thinking and applying it to our agriculture policy rather than the old EU way of basically assuming everyone's a crook until you've got some photograph of a fence or a gate to prove otherwise.
Jim, I think you're on next again.
Yep.
Are you going to use your TB question, which we'd rehearsed?
Yes, we've kept the bugbear till now. Yes. Thank you, Secretary of State. The current TB test we use was created back in the 1900s at a time of the charge of the Light Brigade. Surely it is time to add some 21st century technology to our armoury in the fight against tuberculosis. Why does the current government policy prevent farmers and their vets using private validating testing to aid the control of TB?
Sorry, okay. So you're absolutely right that the efficacy of tests on TB is absolutely crucial to our ability to control it. The skin test is internationally recognised and is the one that all of our trading partners will rely on. And so, abandoning the skin test is not an easy thing to do, given that it's internationally accepted by OIE, and it's the one that all of our trading partners will rely on. So the other thing about the skin test is that although its sensitivity is quite low, and it'll pick up typically 70 to 80% of cases, it produces very, very few false positives. And so as an indicator of herd incidence, the skin test is generally regarded as being quite a good test to use, because if you've got a few animals in the herd that have got it, it'll probably pick up at least one of them, and then you've got a problem in that herd. And what we're then doing is supplementing that with the gamma interferon test, the blood test, which is a much more sensitive test that picks up about 95% of animals that are infected. However, has the corresponding downside that it does give you about 3% false positives. And that means that out of 100 cattle that test positive, 3 of them actually haven't got TB at all. And that's always the trade-off that you've got with these things. So we think that using those 2 tests together, and we've been using the gamma test quite extensively now over the last 4 years, where we get a breakdown in order to root out the disease faster. But using the skin test as a surveillance test to pick up incidents in the herd, and then the gamma test to clear infection from the herd as quickly as possible, has been quite a good combination generally. Now, there are some other tests around, and I know some of them, profess to detect the bacterium rather than the immune response. And we've been assessing some of these. I've always said to our policy team that we need better diagnostics. That's absolutely critical. And we want to do more on this. And if you could get a test that picked up the presence of the bacterium rather than the immune response, that would be great. But the problem is, the one that had been mooted, the activage test, some of the analysis on that showing that it's actually only picking up about 30 to 40% of cases. So it is picking up the bacterium, but it's not sensitive enough to pick up all of the cases that we need it to. So I would love there to be an easy answer on diagnostics and tests, but there isn't so far. But I think what we've been doing over the last 4 to 5 years of having that combination of a skin test and the gamma test has actually probably been the right balance to strike.
Alistair, you've got some views on this. You're on mute.
Yeah. Apologies. I think my biggest frustration, George, is I understand why DEFRA would want to go carefully and cautiously with introduction of a statutory, a new test in a statutory measure, but we have a test that's validated by the IOE to pick up TB infected animals that aren't being picked up by the interferon and skin test. We've gone through years of scientific research to produce that test, and we are still massively restricted in where we can apply that test. So if a farmer is under TB restrictions, there are very few occasions when that farmer can be allowed to privately spend their money testing animals at their cost and remove animals at their cost presently. And I just do not understand why there should be such restrictions. The only thing we've been told, which is that you are poor at prosecuting. If we were not to kill all the animals that tested positive on, say, an IDEX test or an Melplash test, whatever, would be that you'd be poor at prosecuting people that happen to move those animals subsequently. But the trade-off seems crazy. And we would help prevent spread of TB, and we would help farmers, which we know is a significant problem in TB control presently, and hence there's been a big consultation on movement strategy. And the farmers have been dissuaded from doing it. I just do not understand why we have a policy that does that.
Yes, I think so I am looking at this issue. I mean, there's a bit of me that thinks, given the imperfection of some of the tests, there's an argument, in my view, for trying to develop a testing strategy that's not just about test and destroy, test and remove, but which you use a test that you know is not perfect, but might have some advantages and fill in some of the gaps between other tests. And that you should start to use it more as a a surveillance test or maybe a pre-movement test, but whether the penalty for a positive result isn't that the animal must be killed, but you might put it in isolation, and you might double test and use two different tests. And if you get two positive results on both, well, then it's a goner. If it only tests positive on one, you kind of give it the benefit of the doubt, but enter it into an isolation regime. I think we probably need to get better at considering some of these other approaches, and it's something I've asked our veterinary team to look at.
Thank you. So I'm sure these tests could add value to TB control.
But I know you mentioned the Melplash test. I spent most of my summer arguing about Geronimo, the alpaca, and the Melplash test. So you'll recall that's what the Alpaca Society said they wanted. It was the only test they could trust, and they really wanted it. And then when we brought it in, and they then had a case that was high profile, they decided they didn't want it after all and didn't trust it. And it was an unvalidated, untrusted test. So, it's a fraught area for sure.
Which is why you end up with OI validation to remove that risk. And the problem, Geronimo was a very frustrating and complex situation. And so it would have been good to talk about that at a different time. But yes, I do appreciate that it's a difficult world, but that's just the point about private testing, is the farmers at farmers' risk and at farmers' expense, and the taxpayer is taking no risk, no burden. And it's been prevented at the moment. And I would ask you to please look at that and see why that is the case, because a poor ability to prosecute a farmer who didn't, and I entirely agree with you, we've got to move away from an idea that everything that has a positive result necessarily needs to be removed. We don't do that with Eustice disease. Across the world, we manage Eustice disease by removing high risk and managing low risk animals based on seropositivity. We have technology now that could potentially do that, and we're ignoring it. And I'd be extremely grateful if you could look more into that, because it's an area that I think we could do better on.
Yeah, no, it's an area I am keen to look at. So I will follow that up.
Thank you. Have we lost
Nigel,
our chair?
back to you, I think. I think I lost you.
Have we lost Nigel? Has he done a runner? Oh.
He has.
Maybe he's had a power blip or something. I don't think
his last orders at the pub.
Maybe local MP needs to help him with his broadband down in West Dorset.
Well, Chris, I think it's over to you. If there's others that want to come in.
Yeah, I think so. Conscious.
I think Robert Bowditch wants to come in.
Yes, that's right. Looking at the list there. So, now let me just I don't know how we can. We have to. I don't have the admin rights to give Robert the ability to speak. I don't think. Let me just. Lucy, I don't know if you can hear me, but I think in order for Robert to speak, he's got his hand up. We need to. You need to give him the floor, I think. I hope. Oh, Nigel's back, which is always a good sign. Nigel, I don't know if you can just hear us. We were just saying we had, we did have a minute where Robert Baggage was going to ask a question, but he's gone off the list. I think he's taking his hand down now. So as you're back, you're in control. So.
Sorry about that. My internet went down. I'm afraid the wonders of catastrophic internet. I will try and find. I've lost all my questions for some reason. We've reached the end of the time anyway. We did say we'd finish at 9, and albeit obviously we had the odd interruption. So I think I'm sure you've got other things to go to. The members' bar possibly is calling you.
Well, Nigel, the only thing is Robert Bowditch, I think, was trying to come in. I think he was the only one I could see showing as wanting to speak, and I don't know whether you want to give him a chance to.
I can't see any. It may be coming back in again.
His son's here, so I won't really worry about it.
I was going to say, yeah, the Baggage family is well represented, I think.
Yeah, I don't expect yes, father's going senile now, so I'm sure his son comes up with much better questions. Yeah. So really, George, Chris, all I have to do is thank you hugely on behalf of the Society for spending the time. And I'm sorry it disrupted your evening, but we're extremely grateful for you to join us. I hope the questions were sensible. They weren't too demanding. We enjoyed your company, and I hope we look forward to seeing you at the show. It's a genuine offer, and I hope, Chris, you can persuade him to come. I shall be there anyway. George, I will try my lobbying tactics.
Join I'll be down in Cornwall most of August, but I'll if I'm popping back through, I'll try and drop in. Oh, but thank you, Nigel, for sharing. We've covered, and don't worry, you didn't disrupt the evening. The Labour Party did with all those votes that were very disruptive. So sorry for disrupting your evening, and for all of you for your patience for the late start. Good. Thank you, everybody. Thanks very much. We'll see you all soon. Thank you. Cheerio. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.